Hello, good evening and welcome. My name is Danijela Puric-Mladenovic and I'm the host for this evening Daniel's lecture. The title of the talk is Renaturalizing Urban and Peri-Urban Landscapes for People, Biodiversity and Resilience. We are pleased to have Professor Jane Wolf, Chair of our Diversity and Equity Committee, give a land acknowledgement. Please, Jane.
Thank you. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We recognize that people are joining us from all over the world this year as we adapt to life in the pandemic. We encourage you to find out the Indigenous history of the land that you currently call home, and we are grateful to all of those who came before us. Thank you. I'll return the floor to Danijela.
Thank you, Jane. We're excited really to have this talk tonight, more so that because the past few months have magnified all the values of nature and green space in urban and peri-urban landscapes. During this lecture, we will talk about forest conservation and restoration as part of healthy, livable, and sustainable communities. We will also discuss how to balance urbanization with nature and how to forest the architecture. We have 4 international experts from forestry, urban studies, landscape architecture, and architecture background. Their presentations will be followed by a panel discussion attempting to link forest conservation and restoration with planning, buildings, land use planning, and resilient landscapes. I'm pleased to introduce the 4 speakers, and I'll go in order as they will be presenting. Simone Borelli, it's with Forestry Division, United Nations. He's responsible for urban forestry and agroforestry programs on a global scale. Liz O'Brien is with United Kingdom government, forest research, and Liz is the head of the social and economic research group. Fabiano Lemes de Oliveira, it's associate professor in urbanism at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at Politecnico di Milano. And Jana VanderGoot is a licensed architect, designer, and an associate professor of architecture at the University of Maryland, School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. With this, I would like to pass the floor to Simone, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Danijela. Just to clarify, I work for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and not the United Nations Secretariat, but that's just anecdotal. So thanks for the floor. I will try to give you a little bit of a general picture of why we should be really looking at working on peri-urban and urban landscapes for people people, biodiversity and resilience. So now I'll share my screen. Maybe Danijela, you need to stop sharing the background, or I can just override it, I guess. Let's see. Yep, you see my presentation? I guess so.
Yes.
Yes, okay, thanks, Danijela. So basically what I will try to give you today or this evening is a little picture of the wider global picture of urban forestry and the relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals of the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. So we're all aware of what the world looked like 50 years ago. In 1970, this was the world, and this was the level of urbanization. The red dots are cities of 10 million or more. So 50 years ago, we only had 3 cities that had more than 10 million people. 2 years ago, we see a quite different picture. Really, the number of mega cities has grown tremendously, and the number of cities that have between 5 and 10 million has also grown. So the world is progressively urbanizing. And in 2030, it will look something like this. So by then, let's say about 56, I think 58% of all the people in the world will be living in urban areas, and that will create quite a few issues. Of course, cities are already overcrowded and become even more so. Slums will be built close to modern buildings, or vice versa. Modern buildings will be built close to slums. And natural resources will become increasingly threatened by informal settlements and the lack of basic services for many of the people living in cities. We'll be seeing more and more natural disasters due to the fact that the climate is changing and the fact that we have been depleting all the protection that peri-urban forest and landscape have been giving to our cities. And finally, we'll be seeing an increasing level of inequality, unequal access to the resources that are available to people in cities. And it's pretty easy to guess where the rich and poor live in these areas, and how people have less access to all kinds of services, including, of course, as you can see here, green space. Now, what does green space provide to the people? And I think I always like to show this little diagram, which simplifies a little bit what urban forests can actually provide, depending, of course, on where you are. They can provide food, they can provide recreation, they can provide protection from climate change, energy. In many countries in Africa, that's still a big use of energy from firewood, jobs, food, and biodiversity and water. So they really play a key role in supporting people in cities. Now, as you're all aware, one of the main, let's say, leading focuses for us is now the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And to me, there's a close link of all the SDGs to urban forestry. Once again, I could go on for hours on this, but I think I'll just focus on a few of these. Probably the most important is, at least for our work, is SDG 11, which looks at the creation of sustainable and resilient communities. And that's where I feel really urban forestry can play a key role in making cities more sustainable and resilient. SDG 11 has a number of targets within it. And as you can see, these are very closely related to the management of natural resources. So target 11.5 is about reducing the effect of natural disasters. So very clearly, that's how forests and, let's say, landscapes can play a role in that. Target 11.6 is about reducing the environmental impact of cities. Target 11.7, and I think that's probably the biggest point of work for us, is really that of giving universal access to safe and inclusive green and public spaces to all, regardless of their economic status or their conditions. And target 11.7 really looks at implementing policies for inclusions and disaster risk reduction. So as you can see, these objectives or these targets are really closely linked to our work and what we have to be doing over the next years. Let's see. On to the next, yes. And I think very closely linked to what is we're discussing today is target 11A, which I actually put out in full. I thought it might be useful, is really supporting positive economic and social and environmental links between urban, peri-urban, and rural areas by strengthening national and regional development planning. So really, this is really recognizing how important it is to have a global view of planning and how all the different parts of the landscape are interlinked with each other. Another important SDG to which urban forests contribute is climate action, that of reducing the impact of climate change. Cities are getting hotter, cities are getting more polluted, so really trees can play an important role there. Life on land is the protection of biodiversity. here in Nara, Japan, the local biodiversity is having deer in the city, but I guess we all have our peculiarities. It was quite fun to see how people interacted with these tame deer, kind of an integral part of the city. The last point, and I think which was really looks at what I mentioned earlier about inequalities, is really how we need to work hard on reducing inequalities, both in terms of green space, but also in terms of all the ecosystem and health benefits that are brought by urban forest cities. Now, this was the very high picture of the SDGs. However, these SDGs are not something abstract, but really increasingly are being brought down to the local level. A lot of communities, a lot of cities are taking local action to actually make these SDGs into something real, and then monitor them and see how they can help strengthen the community. I did a quick check to see what is happening in Canada. Indeed, you have an SDG indicator portal. The IISD is monitoring how the SDGs are being implemented in cities. I must say that they're not focusing right now on SDG 11 and on the role of, let's say, urban forest and so on. And that's maybe something you might like to take up and check to see how you can really have a better look at what is happening in Canada specifically, and many other countries have similar indicators. And they create these briefing notes, and really there's a looking at how cities are taking action to promote the SDGs at a local level. I think I will stop there for now and look forward to discussing a little more, maybe going a little more in depth on the different aspects we're covering today. Back to you, Danijela.
Thank you. So we'll have all questions after the presentation. So Liz, would you please share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Is that showing now, Danijela?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thanks very much. So yes, I work for Forest Research, which is Britain's principal organisation for forestry and tree-related research. And my group's been focusing on the complex relationship between trees, forests and society for the past 20 years. And we're particularly interested in human-nature relationships, whether that's people engaging, visiting, connecting with forests, or those who are managing and making decisions about them. So in this presentation, I'd like to focus on issues to do with health and well-being benefits of trees and forests, as well as some of the wider social and cultural values, and how these are taken note of or not in decision-making, and also touch on what is special about trees and forests, and finish with just a bit of discussion around the COVID pandemic and engagement with nature. So there's a growing recognition of the importance of nature for health, but also for broader well-being. In the UK, we've seen nature added into health strategies in recognition of the physical and mental health benefits of contact with nature. And that importance has been written into the government's 25-year environment plan, which is a cross-government plan, not department specific. And in this document, it outlines that nature, the natural environment, is essential to our health and well-being. But as you can see, we've got a problem with mental ill health in the UK, as in many countries. It's costing a lot of money to deal with that. We have a lot of people who are inactive, and we also have problems with overweight and obesity. But within that focus on nature, there's a kind of strong focus on the role of trees and forests. And I was involved in a Forest Europe project with a number of people across different European countries. And we reviewed evidence on health and sustainable forest management. And we used this diagram in the publication that talks about the mechanisms through which health benefits from nature can be realized. So potential for reduction in exposure to noise and air pollution, reductions in stress, improvements in restoration, so that can have a psychological as well as a physiological element. Forests are also places for people to be physically active, they're places for social contact, and there's also opportunities for strengthening the immune system. And this area of work has been going on for a long time. The Forest, Trees and Human Health book was a European network, and that came out probably somewhere around 2008. But more recently, in the last month, the Forests for Public Health book has been published from a conference in Greece last year, which had a strong number of delegates from Japan and South Korea doing a lot of work in this area. So there's a strong focus on urban forests within Europe. We've got regular conferences within the UK. There's a European Forum on Urban Forestry that holds regular events and conferences. And I was involved in a network looking at green infrastructure in the urban forest and some of the kind of services, benefits and disbenefits from that. And we produced this book on the urban forest. And I also brought together some people to publish a paper on the cultural ecosystem benefits of urban and peri-urban green infrastructure. Some of our work is focused on the ecosystem services and benefits delivered by urban forests, and we're trying to think more about what are the benefits from the single tree to the line of trees in the street, clusters of trees through to the forest environment. Colleagues of mine have also been involved in a European network looking at urban forest governance, who's making decisions about urban forests, how communities are being engaged and involved, what sort of partnerships are going on. But there's still quite a lot of work to be done on understanding, what types of urban forests deliver what sort of benefits, for whom and under what circumstances. So I just wanted to touch on the idea of kind of values for nature and approaches to valuation. So thinking, more broadly than health, we're carrying out some work at the moment on the social and cultural values of trees and forests at risk from pests and diseases. And we've been carrying out a scoping review. This table that you can see on the left is the different values expressed in the nearly 200 papers that we've been looking at. And we've tried to categorize those into kind of broad values and then subcategories. So what you can see here is a kind of whole range of ways in which the values for nature and forests are being expressed. But there are a whole range of different ways of valuing things. So on the right is an iTree study from London's urban forest. And that focuses much more on regulating services around kind of carbon storage, air quality, stormwater control, and it also places a monetary value onto those benefits. And it does sometimes try to capture amenity value as well, but it doesn't capture this kind of breadth of social and cultural values that the other diagram is showing. So there are a lot of discussions taking place to consider how or whether these approaches can be integrated to inform decision-making. This diagram comes from the UK's Tree Health Resilience Strategy, and it's just trying to identify the kind of key values of forests and trees. And the dark green circles are where those economic values have been identified for different services and benefits. And then in the yellow, there are some elements that have been monetized, but in the lighter green are the things that are at the moment more quantified or qualitative. And the gray that you can see around those sort of circles are about the kind of uncertainty of those values. So there is this debate about, what in the light green circles can be monetized and quantified or should remain qualitative, particularly when you're thinking maybe about more cultural and symbolic values. So just to provide an example of this, what we mean here, we've got values on the left. One expresses kind of recreation value per visit to the forest, and the other quantifies the percentage of how many visits to nature or to woodlands specifically. And on the right, we've got these values expressed qualitatively that encompass different aspects of what trees and forests mean to people. So the first quote's talking about how trees act as protection and support for this person who's feeling anxious, when they're feeling anxious and stressed, helps this person to reflect and contemplate life. And then the second quote is a broader kind of social value of spaces where people can come together, spaces like forests and woodlands, where sometimes people feel freer to kind of chat to strangers than they would in an indoor or street environment. So this debate continues about how to reflect some of those qualitative and quite rich descriptions into decision-making. So the research we've undertaken over the years with people in urban and sort of peri-urban areas, all sorts of different people, we've tried to sort of get what are some of the sort of things that are special about treescapes, whether we're talking about individual trees, or as I say, trees within the street or forests themselves. And often people talk about this sort of longevity and trees being the sort of link between the past, the present and the future. Often sort of talking about, you know, I wonder what this tree has witnessed because it's been here maybe for decades or hundreds of years or even thousands of years. And forests and trees are crucial in the urban environment to screen people from noise in the built environment, providing sort of feelings of escape and freedom, away, people getting away from everyday stresses. There's also those sort of links to folklore, and we've got the major oak and Sherwood Forest in England linked to stories of Robin Hood. And trees can often be symbols of strength and stability. People sometimes liken forests to cathedrals, helping them to kind of reflect on life. And also sometimes people, particularly with mental health problems, talk about trees and forests as places where they don't feel judged. And because of all the COVID crisis, we decided to undertake an online survey about engagement with nature and trees and forests before and during COVID. And one of the questions we asked was about people's appreciation of trees and whether that had increased or decreased. And what we found that over 50% of the respondents, we had about over 2,000 respondents, there was a significant or some increase in their appreciation of both forests, but also trees in other locations. So trees in their garden, in their local park, along footpaths and waterways, and in their sort of street and nearby streets. So just coming to the end, I just want to finish by outlining that the pandemic's raising a lot of issues that Simone's already identified about inequalities in our society. And in terms of those in relation to nature, they're often kind of manifest by things around, you know, people not having access to nature, the quality of the nature that's near to where they live, proximity and the amount and size. And this report that you can see here is from a cross-government group, sorry, not a department, that's brought together a whole range of people over the summer through surveys, by looking at social media, through interviews and focus groups, asking people about life in general. So people have touched on housing, work, travel, green space. And there was a clear conclusion coming from this report that there's a really kind of strong desire to have a much fairer and greener society. So this is a kind of chance and an opportunity potentially to do that. There's lots of talk about green recovery. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, what happens in the next few years. So thank you for listening. If you want to find out a bit more about our research, then please do visit our website.
Thank you, Liz, so much. Now we'll have Fabiano. And
I'm trying now to find my presentation here. I can't find it. Yes. There we are.
Okay. Oops.
Can you see it?
Yes, it's on the screen. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Danijela Puric-Mladenovic for the invitation and the Daniels faculty for hosting such a relevant and interesting event today. I'm going to try to keep to my 10 minutes. I come from an architecture and urban planning background. Most of my research has been at the intersection of urban and environmental planning. And that's the perspective I'm going to come from when I talk about future forests and the city today with you and in the discussion afterwards. And in particular, I want to bring up some ideas about a potential balanced relationship with nature. And in doing so, I first want to refer back to a key moment in our history that in fact is the beginning of our climate crisis and our ecological crisis today, which is the Industrial Revolution. And here I want to highlight two main ideas. The first one being that we realized then that our anthropic intervention was indeed damaging the environment, was damaging nature and the countryside around us. So here we have a quote by Sir Richard Phillips in A Morning Walk from London to Kew, where he highlights that smoke was indeed blighting and destroying vegetation. So there is a first moment in our recent history where we started realizing that in a serious manner. We didn't quite know that we could in fact destroy the planet by then, but the signs of the alert was already being given. The other image on the right is an engraving by Gustave Doré, who was a French artist who moved to London and lived in this and trying to depict the quality of life, or perhaps the lack of quality of life of working class residents at the time. And here we see, in fact, that one of the greatest inventions of mankind, the city, the idea of us living in an urban environment together, the common habitat of most of the planet's citizens today, were in fact being places that were leading us to diseases that was a trap that eventually would, as Sir Henry George highlights, lead to a sense of deterioration of us physically and mentally. So the idea that both we were destroying the environment around us, and in fact we were destroying ourselves, destroying our own habitats, appears very strongly. In the history of planning, we had various attempts ever since to start, well, to discuss how, in principle, we could revert the situation and turn cities inhabitable once again. On the left-hand side, we have the very famous plan by Cerdà for Barcelona in the middle of the 19th century. And here we see the idea of going outside the existing city and creating a grid that would, in principle, urbanize the countryside, urbanize the space around the city, and in doing so, also ruralize or bring nature inside the lives of the urban residents once again. The importance of Frederick Olmsted and Covert Vaux has been discussed across the literature, and in particular the idea of articulating various different elements such as parkways, parks, lakes, in a system that could again bring nature, in this case, into the existing city, but also to organize planning and think about how some natural processes could help us in this endeavor. And on the right-hand side, one of the most famous diagrams in the history of planning by Ebenezer Howard, highlighting the idea of the garden city and how we would, in principle, be able to create new settlements much more in balance with nature, sitting on a canvas of the countryside, well spaced out, and with a green belt that would protect the countryside and avoid the urban expansion into the countryside. At the beginning of the 20th century, we have a range of questions that were placed around how, in fact, we could plan for growth and still have the connection to the countryside, the connection to nature that was destroyed with unplanned sprawl. And I bring to you here a couple of diagrams that appeared in the first International Town Planning Conference of 1911. And you may think, well, that's rather old. But you'll see, and I'll try to show how this is still relevant to us today. This diagram is by an engineer called Rudolf Eberstadt. And he was, again, very interested in how we could plan for expansion. And he was very critical of the Green Belt for that reason, because according to him, it would constrain the city, and that was one of the purposes of the Green Belt, but also that would keep most and a lot of the green spaces away if it was implemented on its own. And in fact, the cities were not growing concentrically anymore, based on the expansion of city walls, especially in Europe, but they were growing along the lines of transportation routes that going out into the countryside. And in between those lines of connection, there would be space left over that we could transform in urban forests or forests in parks and bring the countryside straight into the core of cities. So what we have is a fundamental attempt to address the question of balance, regardless of the size of the city at this stage. And in the history of planning and the history of this idea that I explored in Green Wedge Urbanism in my book, we see that the initial friction between belts and wedges gets resolved, and the very idea of green wedges was appealing to many planners across the globe. We see some examples in Germany, in the UK with Patrick Abercrombie, Australia with Solomon, and Brazil. Perhaps the most iconic plan that implemented green wedges is Copenhagen's Finger Plan from 1947. And I was doing some research about Toronto, and I haven't been to Toronto yet, and I would love to be able to. And I found this master plan from 1943, which seems to be dialoguing with similar ideas. Again, the question of challenges, and Simone has already put forward a few of those challenges for us. We know we are going to live in a much more urbanized planet. 70% of our population will be living in cities. We are going to be in the region of 10 billion people living on the planet. Around 75% of our CO2 emissions are done by cities. And we also know that the more cities we have normally, the more impact on the ecological vitality of the planet we tend to have. Hence, we do have what I call an apparent paradox of sustainable development, which is the need to accommodate more people in cities, more urbanization, be it horizontal, vertical, in various different ways in which we can conceive that, but also to reduce our impact on the planet and hopefully increase the presence of nature, increase the quantity of green spaces and distribution of those green spaces. And it is a paradox because, again, normally the more urbanization we have, the more impact on the planet we have, and the fewer green spaces we tend to have. And the time is ticking, and we do need to shift a gear in order to achieve that. So we are, in fact, running out of time to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. The IPCC report about climate change highlighted the importance of acting urgently to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2, and suggesting, for instance, the planting of 1 billion hectares of forest across the globe in order to achieve that. And the discussion about nature in cities has entered planning in many different ways. And recently, the idea of ecosystem services is very much a part of our discussions in academia and in practice, green infrastructure as a network that would bring together plant and natural and semi-natural areas to deliver such ecosystems has been on the agenda, and more recently, as we know, the idea of nature-based solutions, which makes this link with challenges very, very strong. And I think this is particularly relevant. So it's how nature can help us address the challenges that we currently have and that we're expecting to have in the next years. Here is just one example of application of green wedges. This is the case of Stockholm, which is pretty much facing the paradox that I mentioned of the need to accommodate more residents and to remain a city that is livable, that is dense, and also green. Stockholm has 10 green wedges that have been consolidated in the last decades with a range of different functions, including urban forests. And we see, again, a great attempt to connect the regional dimension of those green wedges also with the human scale, with the scale of the developments that happen in and around Stockholm. Here we see an image of one of those green wedges arriving at Hammarby Sjöstad, which is a sustainable development towards the southeast of Stockholm. And you see this ecological corridor, this kind of branch of the green wedge, coming straight into it over a motorway in what they call an eco-duct. So more recently, I've been looking at the questions of the hyper diffusion of sprawl in cities, or the question of post-metropolis, and how the dichotomies of urban and rural have been questioned. And I would like to put forward just briefly 3 points for us to think about and potentially discuss later on. And I'm departing from the question of how the idea of green wedges or the various models derived from this idea could help us address these scenarios. And the first point I want to put forward is that we do need to transform these in-between spaces, the spaces between motorways or the areas that are not urban, that are not suburban, they're not rural, those spaces that appear to be suspended. And in fact, transforming that could help us potentially redefining what we call urbanity, what we call rurality, and our relationship with nature. Milan has an interesting program that's current. The idea is to plant 3 million trees before 2030. And that's going ahead, and it's a very interesting program. Green wedges, by being large-scale green space models, they have the possibility of hosting a range of ecosystem services through various nature-based solutions. And they do need to be included within multi-scalar networks. And the final point before I complete this presentation is this idea that we need to protect, we need to restore, but we also need to find spaces for regreening, renaturing. So finding, transforming, and creating more forests and more spaces for nature cities is very much part of our agenda and what we need to be doing. So just a couple of images. If you want to know a little bit more about the research I've been doing on green wedges and blending cities with nature, you can consult these publications or write to me, and I'll be happy to follow up with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Fabiano. Our next speaker is Jana. Jana, please share your screen. We'll make sure everything is working. Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. It's great to be here tonight and wonderful to hear the other presentations. I think there are a lot of crossovers, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. What I hope to bring to the conversation today is similar to what Fabiano presented, and that's really a perspective from the design disciplines on this renaturalization of urban and peri-urban landscapes. You know, it's been part of conversations, I think, in landscape architecture and urban design We've heard phrases like landscape urbanism and ecological urbanism, biophilic design or green design. Tonight, I'll focus just in the short time that I have on architecture. So it's kind of scaled down from the urban design scale. And I will specifically talk about the relationship between forest and architecture and how forest can be an inspiring model and metaphor for architecture, especially as we're starting to think about carbon. So just, you know, I'm glad I'm showing this slide because it kind of segues from the last presentation. I think there is this really long, rich history of designers, architects, urban designers thinking about, you know, forest and green spaces in cities. And I think the model has been, I saw one of the questions in the Q&A, I think the model that I've seen mostly is really this sort of development model where cities are spreading out. And what you see in a lot of the plans is this kind of tabula rasa frame of mind. And I think that shows up here in this plan, which shows the forest as the foundation for urbanism, which is good to see. But here we see that it's an image of the new city, right? This is from 1944. And clearly there's this idea of kind of new territory. The forest is the basis, but we are reworking the language, and you can tell that from this kind of grid-like pattern. So that's one of the models that I've seen, you know, so far in the disciplines. The other model that I've seen, and this has come up more recently, and I think it's been very productive, is the model of taking droscapes or waste landscapes, post-industrial landscapes, and thinking of the forest as, or reintroducing the forest into the city as a way of healing those landscapes. So what you see here is a speculative plan for the city of Detroit, Michigan in the United States. And it's part of a book called Stalking Detroit. And Charles Waldheim writes about you know, the forest and schemes for renaturalizing a city that's falling apart and a city that's been heavily polluted. And it's interesting that that book was written in the 90s, but now what's happening, in fact, is that there's a development argument for using trees in Detroit as a way to deal with some of the economic problems. And so a real estate developer is acquiring many, many properties in Detroit, demolishing the buildings that are there that are mostly uninhabited, and planting tree farms. And so you see here all of the properties that have been acquired. And the houses on the properties have been demolished. So this considered this sort of droscape. And now the trees are a way to renaturalize or heal the landscape. It is part of this social movement to bring back Detroit, which is good. But, you know, still it's this idea that there's this tabula rasa, or this kind of start over, and the trees are the first part of that. And so you see the trees growing up here. This is an aerial view where you start to see the properties that have been demolished and the green is coming back. So those are two models, this model of the drawscape and healing through the reintroduction of the forest. And then also the model in urban planning of the kind of tabula rasa and sprawl or development, where we're pushing out and we're creating these new cities with the forest as an underlay. What I'd like to talk about today, as I narrow in on architecture, is what I'm calling a living carbon approach to urbanism. And just want to share two projects that I think really get at this idea and are very hopeful in my mind, examples in the design disciplines. So this first structure here is called Hi-Fi. It's a building called Hi-Fi. It's by the firm The Living from New York City. And the structure is made out of mycelium bricks. So mycelium is a part of a fungus. It's the kind of structural part of the fungus. And the bricks are created by taking agricultural waste, introducing fungal spores, letting those spores grow as they eat the waste, the compost, and then curing the bricks, stopping the growth, curing the bricks, and building the building out of that. Why am I showing this example, as we're talking about the forest? I think I love this project because it talks about that sort of the decay cycle of the forest system, right? It talks about the dead parts of the forest and how we can think about that part of the system when we think about construction. And the main idea behind this project was that the building was constructed and it was also designed to decay. So here it is. It's a beautiful outdoor structure, right? So one of the things that has to be dealt with is with an outdoor structure using a product like this, how long does it last? But nevertheless, this was the experiment. And I love this diagram on the left created by the firm, which shows the idea that the structure is grown, created, and then it decays, which means that buildings and architecture, instead of being the cycle on the top, right, instead of being the sort of waste leg that comes out of the natural carbon cycle, that architects have the opportunity to put their buildings back into the natural carbon cycle. And the firm is calling, this project part of the glucose cycle, because the fungi are eating the glucose from the agricultural waste. So that's one way of thinking about architecture through the frame of the forest. Another project I'd like to share, and it's great because this project was featured in the last presentation, is the Bosco Verticale, which are 2 forest skyscrapers that were constructed in the city of Milan, Italy in 2014. And really, in the discipline of architecture, these are the first buildings, first skyscrapers that were built and wrapped in trees. Architects have been drawing buildings wrapped in greenery for ages, but the thing about Borelli's studio, and this is like what happened in the Detroit project that I showed, Pants Woodlands, is that Borelli's studio figured out how to convince a developer to pay for a project like this in a dense city like Milan. And so that to me is a big breakthrough, and why I like to pull this project in particular out to talk about it. But I also think this project is helpful to look at because of the larger vision of a biological city that the architects have created. And this image is for one of their other projects, but it shows, not only these forest skyscrapers, but the forest skyscrapers sitting in a biological city, as they would call it. And so Bio Milano is their plan for the biological city. And there are many component parts. The forest skyscraper, I'm calling a biosystem that fits within a new kind of biome, the human forest biome. And the skyscrapers are these sort of totems, these markers that stand up as a signal that this is the biological city. But there are other parts. Fabiano talked about the green wedges, the Metro Bosco. There are exhibition spaces, and also what Borelli Studio is calling Casa Bosco. And the Casa Bosco are this idea for high density housing made out of mass timber. And so they're showing here that this city would be rezoned so that residential areas are saddled up next to clean industries. And here the clean industry is the construction of the wood housing. And that this would be a new kind of urbanism. And so, cross-laminated timber has really exploded in the field of architecture. Everybody's designing with it. you know, it's pretty amazing to think about building cities that hold carbon, right? When we build buildings out of mass timber, we are potentially sequestering and holding carbon. If we build enough, maybe, you know, developers can get carbon credits, right? Which has some market value. But I showed this project which is Murray Grove, a high-rise in London, built in 2009. And I like showing this project in particular because the architects did a couple things. They really did address the housing crisis that we will be facing in cities by making an economic argument to the developers that they worked with that it was cheaper to build this building in wood. They also made an ecological argument that the carbon footprint of this building is lower than a building in concrete or steel or brick veneer. And then finally, they had conversations with the building code officials, and they changed the building code to allow them to actually build a building like this out of wood, right? Because there was concern about fire. But they did testing, and they noted that when you have mass timber, as opposed to the stick-built timber, it actually functions very well in fires. In 2016, in the United States, the building codes changed to allow architects to design mass timber buildings. And many of you might be familiar with this beautiful building, the Wood Innovation and Design Center by Michael Green Architects in British Columbia, Canada. Built in wood, which is a wonderful example of all of the ways that timber and mass timber can be used for architecture. Here's a factory view of this process of creating the mass timber, which essentially are these huge pieces of plywood made out of 2x4. So there's small amounts of adhesive, and in fact, sometimes dowels connect them, which makes them lower in terms of their toxicity for the inhabitants. This vision that Boeri's studio highlights here and that other architects are building is very different than the vision of urbanism here, the lumber, what's featured here in the lumber district of Chicago, which I would say is a kind of a monoculture version of wood urbanism, where you have the industry and it's not worked into the other fabric, it's not worked into the other building typologies. So I'm really excited about this more integrated vision of wood as a building product and wood as coming into the cities alongside for the actual trees and reforestation. In the last couple slides I'll show, I just wanted to touch on something that I think, it came up in Liz's presentation, the kind of social cultural values, which are sometimes harder to assess, but no less important. She had the beautiful slide that talked about like the value of treescapes. And from my perspective, as an architect, I think the aesthetic piece, the aesthetic conversation of forests is very important. And I want to talk about that through the lens of this Bosco Verticale project. So the first vision of the architect was of this kind of messy biological city. And in order to make the argument for this building to be built, for the forest to come up onto the vertical surface, certain things had to be edited back and refined and constrained. For example, the image on the left shows this kind of gray water system, like a forest, interacts with the hydrological cycle. And that the gray water from the building would be used to irrigate the trees, and the trees would catch the stormwater, et cetera. That had to be taken out of the project as the building was constructed, and it's part of one of the critiques I have of the project. The other thing was that over time, the images of the building became more sterile, right? The forest became more of this kind of application. It was brought into control in these clean squares on the elevation. But I would say, one of the the potentials, one of the greatest potentials of the forest skyscraper project, no matter what the critique is about the trees, what it takes to make a tree survive up on a skyscraper. I think one of the greatest benefits of the project is that it's starting to shift the image of Milan. So when you exit the train station and you come into this door, this part of the city of Milan, you see the silhouette. You see this furry silhouette, which is a very, very different view of Milan, right? It is this really marker of a biological city. The other thing that you see in the neighborhood around these towers is that people are starting to have permission to reintroduce other kinds of vegetation in ways that they hadn't before, right? So on the left-hand side, not only do you see potted plants, but you also start to see, the ivy on the buildings. I'll just end with this last slide in line with the aesthetic piece of it, and say that I also think it's important that we think about how we draw projects as architects, that we draw them as active and living instead of as something static. So the image on the right is an exhibition that shows, forest as something that moves and is not static. And the image on the left is a forest that's wired with Wi-Fi. That's the last image I have. So I will stop sharing.
Yeah.
Turn it over to Danijela.
Yeah, thank you so much, all. I mean, I personally could start with a million questions, but I'm not going to. What's exciting that we touch exactly what we wanted, even from mycorrhizal properties, and we didn't even get into soil where we are going to grow all of this future forest. However, I'll stop here and I'll get to some of the questions that to all of you. It would be good if you could hear your opinion. One question that we have, it's I would love to hear thoughts on the trade-offs between dense cities to protect peri-urban forests and less dense cities with more room for trees throughout.
Okay, how do you want to do this, Diana? We just go around?
Yeah, maybe in the same order as you guys were presenting. It's just we have to make sure that we have time for a few other questions that are coming.
Sure. Well, I think it's difficult to make a choice between dense, and less dense. I think a lot depends on where you are, the history, and the conditions in which you are. But I guess I was recently in the Gulf region, and there they're having a problem because now they're building very dense cities with very small buildings. And they only get the typical house in the Gulf is 300 square meter lot. You build every inch of it, and then you don't leave any space for greenery, because that's something that, it's not the private owner has to do it, the city has to do it. So I think it's really a matter of changing the paradigm a little and really looking at how private developers and the public domain can really start planning cities in an integrated manner to make sure that the spaces are left at the right time, and maybe we start looking at less densification and more maybe verticalization. I think Jana was really looking at how vertical forests or vertical buildings can actually help reduce the densification and leave more open space. I think that recently I saw a presentation from Stefano Borelli, and he was saying, 15 skyscrapers have the equivalent trees of Central Park. Maybe they don't have the same services, but they have the same number of trees. So I think that there's one answer to this. It's really a matter of looking at where you are and what you can actually achieve with what you have around you. Over.
Liz?
Oh, right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Simone. It's not a kind of one size fits all. You've got to kind of understand the current city and culture and society of that particular area. One of the things from the publication that I showed at the end of my presentation about this debate around a greener and fairer society that's gone on in the UK in the summer was a discussion around this idea of a 15-minute neighbourhood. So whether your kind of work, your green space, you know, the places that you need to get to within a very short distance of where you live. So it would be really interesting to think what that kind of results in terms of what a city might look like. And I think there's a whole kind of range of things around, I think, you know, some of the things that Jana talked about in terms of the, or was it Fabiano, around that sort of the post-industrial landscapes or areas with derelict and neglected land that are often in cities and what we're doing with those places. Lots of opportunities there for increasing the kind of forest, the green space. So I think, yeah, it's not going to be a kind of one size fits all. It's got to be something that's much more, you know, involving people as well. So thinking about, you know, engaging people, participation, thinking about inclusivity, and also how you might address some of the inequalities that have arisen over the past few decades.
Thank you. Fabiano, do you have anything?
That's me now. Yes. For me, it's a question of land consumption, as well as a question of accessibility to quality and green space in spaces of an appropriate size. If we think about the way in which cities have grown in the last 100 years or so, and the huge amount of land consumption that this has led to, we start relating that to the question of the deterioration of the ecological vitality and the landscapes around cities, we can start seeing a strong correlation between unplanned growth and deterioration of habitats. So for me, it's important that we do consider questions of density, but we do need to ensure that good accessibility to good quality, large, if possible, green spaces can be achieved, can be reached close to where people live. And that's one of the reasons why I believe the green wedge model is still very attractive as a model, because it could indeed help us think about a city that's both dense and green. So in that sense, I think this dichotomy could be resolved. And I believe it's one of the tasks of planning, in fact, to resolve that. And Jana showed some interesting examples as well at architectural level that are very important if we are going to go for cities that are going to be denser. The pandemic also has put to question the importance of our interior spaces, the importance of the views that we have from our rooms, from where we were locked down, and how fortunate those that had balconies and had views to trees and views to green spaces felt when they were locked in their own houses. So I think, again, it's very important that we, as we move hopefully out of this pandemic, that we carry these reflections with us in our planning activities.
Jana?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that's been said. I think, you know, in my mind, there is a sort of have your cake and eat it too with the green wedge model, right? That you can have density. And I think especially, I mean, I speak from the perspective of the United States, where we could have a lot more density in the cities, you know, that we already have constructed. And so I think moving towards density, but also thinking about access to the green spaces. I think one of the problems in the United States is the public transportation system. And that if you have a decentralized city, you're going to be dependent on the automobile, which has its own, you know, its whole set of problems. So I think public transit-oriented development is really important way to go. but also making sure that people have a way to get out of that dense city, because it isn't always necessarily a healthy place.
So yeah, that's great, and because we really have diverse questions here. Some of them are more planning, and we have some ecological questions here. One was coming about species that we select and diversity in urban forests, because we can plant all of those trees, but we need to think about diversity and how to protect native vegetation. So if you could hear your opinion on that, perhaps with...
Yes, definitely. The more resilient, I would say, the more diverse the forest is, normally the more resilient it is. So a simplified model of urban forest is definitely less resilient to climate change, to outside shocks, to anything. So I would say definitely the highest possible diversity and possibly maintaining native species. That's not always possible, of course, because sometimes native species might be not very much resistant to air pollution or other things. So you have to make some compromises sometimes. But definitely, I would say native species should be the preferred choice. Another important consideration about diversity, and I'm sure I think Liz maybe touched upon it briefly, is all this new research that's going into the importance of the microbiome in cities. And so the more diverse your green space or your forest, the more we get exposed to different bacteria, different microorganisms that can really make a difference in terms of human health. There's been a lot of studies on really the close link we have within this diversity of our landscape and ecosystem and our health, and also how close the forest inside the cities are with the surrounding areas. In fact, speaking of the architectural side, I've just seen some designs of buildings built especially to maximize the impact of the diversity on microbiome. So there are some architects that are really studying the link between your immune system and the nature around you. So no, by all means, the more diverse, the better. And once again, native species probably, and in some cases, if necessary, some exotics too. Back to you, Danijela.
Yeah, so Liz, would you have anything to add? I'm sure you do.
Well, diversity, yeah, is really important. There's a lot of push in the UK at the moment for more woodland creation and woodland expansion. So this is a very sort of live topic, and there's lots of discussion about the native, non-native debate. And we're very much thinking about with climate change that some of the native species, we have to think about other species and other provinces, because some of the things that we've got at the moment will be kind of moving further north across the UK, and what we plant in the south might be kind of different in the future. There's also a lot of concern obviously about tree health issues and the various kind of pests and diseases that we're facing at the moment, and how can we look at, for example, we've got a big problem with ash dieback, so we're looking at trees that may be resilient. But there is that very live debate about diversity, and just Simone talking about the microbiome. I've just read a paper looking at in Finland at children's schoolyards, one of which there was an intervention to add kind of some soil into the yard and play area for children, and changes in their skin bacteria and their gut microbiome to being more similar to children who go to forest school. So really kind of interesting movement on that research at the moment.
Jana? Oh, you're muted. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, Fabiano, were you next in the order? Did you want to?
Oh, sorry, my apology.
No, it's okay. Well, of course, I agree. No, I think the question of resilience is crucial when we talk about all the different levels of our urban living, and including the presence of trees and forests in cities. I would just add that in some cases, exotic plants that have been adapted over years and years can perform very well as well. So I think it would be important also to consider those. And I just want to make a reference back to the introductory talk that we had, the introductory presentation that talked about indigenous knowledge, you know, and how important that is today. And I think this is also something that we start to turn back to understand further now as the discussions about nature-based solutions are progressing, and how in fact we could learn still a lot or relearn some of the skills and some of those knowledges that you know, in many cases have been lost or forgotten in regards to that kind of relationship with trees and plants. And also the idea that we can consider to the vertical structure when we are doing those projects. I suppose we have various landscape architecture students around, and it's something that we discuss with our students. So what's the surface like? You know, what's the kind of the middle grounds, the bushes, and then the trees, so we can create complex and rich environments.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, right? The debate about native species and invasive species in the Bosco Verticale project. Native species were used, but they really had to treat them like intensive care patients, right? They had to like grow them in a nursery for 10 years beforehand. They had to submit them to wind tunnel testing. They have to irrigate them. They're on sensors. And it's interesting because 20 years earlier in Milan, same city, an architect, Friedrich Hundertwasser, installed what he called a tree tenant into the window of a building. And he actually spec'd ailanthus, you know, which is an invasive tree that can grow in like a ½ an inch of soil on a stone windowsill, right? So, you know, he determined that we need a species that will survive without maintenance and actually flourish and thrive. And so, you know, there is something to say for if we are creating these urban environments that lead us to urban ecology, that maybe we need to study these urban ecologies that are created with the invasive species to find if they have value. And ecologists have done this. Stuart Pickett in the city of Baltimore, that sometimes these urban ecologies are actually quite diverse. Peter Del Tredici, who teaches at Harvard University, also calls what he calls invasive species spontaneous vegetation, right? Instead of weeds. It's spontaneous vegetation, the species that do well and thrive in cities. So I'm not making a pitch for invasive species. I just think we need to study our urban ecologies more alongside trying to preserve, you know, the native ecosystems because of all of the interconnections that have developed within the native ecosystems.
So to follow up along the line of just invasive and non-native species, it's a tricky question. So are we making ecological trash, and what's the driver? What's your opinion on urban soils? Because that's something that during development gets destroyed, and definitely soil protection policies could play a huge role in some of the successes.
Yeah. Thanks, Danijela. Yes, I think my favorite example I always cite is the new towns in the UK. If you talk to Alan Simpson, you'll hear the story. But essentially, the choice they made in some of the new towns in Tilford, for example, was that of not taking the topsoil away, but really building the forest first and then the city around the forest, not the other way around. Sense that the topsoil and the trees remained, and they just, you know, used the landscape and cut and built without really affecting the soils. So I would say yes, definitely you want to protect the soils as you can, but as Fabiano was mentioning earlier, urban sprawl and urban, has really destroyed a lot of the land. So definitely we need to work on structurally structured soils in some cases to make sure that the plants have the conditions in which they can build, and let's definitely change the building codes to make sure that the topsoil is maybe preserved separately to make sure that it can be reused afterwards. Once again, it's always a battle between expediency, cost, and then the price of maintaining healthy soils in cities. A lot of permeable solutions are coming along now, trying to increase permeability in the cities, and that of course depends a lot on how you can maintain the health of the soil. And as Liz also mentioned, healthy soils, healthy biome, healthy microbiome. So we want to keep our soils healthy to keep ourselves healthy too. Over.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We've got colleagues at Forest Research looking at, creating forests on post-industrial landscapes that have been polluted. So obviously the kind of soil is really important. We've got scientists looking at the soil, but we've also, I'm just thinking about, for example, London, 47% green space in London. A huge amount is also gardens, people's gardens, and often in sort of development, people sort of dig into the soil in their garden and find all sorts of waste that's been left there by, developers. So we do need much more kind of focus on soil protection, and how to kind of plan that in. It's become increasingly important.
Would you have anything to add, or we have some questions about a good example of cities that have implemented the green wedges or something similar along those lines, green systems?
Okay, well, yes, there are various cities around the world that have implemented green wedges and are still improving and working with this model to address the new challenge that we have. So I mentioned Stockholm in the presentation. I would also highlight Helsinki. For instance, Helsinki Central Park is one of the green wedges in their green infrastructure plan, in their vision 2050. And it's an 11-kilometer long park that connects the city center out to Helsinki Park, which is essentially an urban forest. So it is a landscape that presents a multitude of uses and functions. Melbourne, for example, is another city, Copenhagen, as I mentioned. So there are very interesting cases of cities that have been working with the model over decades, but also appearing in new projects. I also mentioned in the book a proposal by Sasaki Architects, who have been doing a fantastic job in integrating ecology and urban planning. So they've created a master plan for an arts and agricultural city in China, Songzhuan, and it has this agricultural and ecological wedge right at the core of how the urban structure is organized. So there are plenty of interesting examples to study and to learn from.
Anyone has anything to add to that one? Or
I mean, just the conversation about the soils, I think, is extremely important. And I'll speak from the kind of brownfield architecture perspective. I think one of the paradox that comes up, we're talking about a lot of paradoxical situations, is that the kinds of compacted gravel and soils that are needed to construct buildings as we construct them now are not fertile soils. They're actually dead soils. And so I think part of the conversation for architects, at least, is thinking about buildings as an extension of the forest, as something that's living, right? And that the soil would be the foundation, and that your building won't be healthy or do well unless you have healthy soil. But it's tricky because the model is permanence, right? Our infrastructure and our buildings, the model is permanence. We will have to switch to kind of soft infrastructure and soft buildings in order to think about the foundation for all these systems as healthy soil. But I think that, you know, I hope we move in that direction. I hope there's a movement.
Yeah. We had one interesting question that bridges quite lots of forest ecology and biodiversity with green wedges. The city of Toronto has something that it's called Toronto ravines, which are left not as a part of by chance because of the steep slope. There's a very narrow strips of native vegetation within the city, and kind of they mimic green wedges, but the problem is that they're so narrow and their biodiversity have been impacted. So we have a question, can you speak to the importance of creating wider spikes or green wedges within the cities? And I'm assuming it's making sure that the biodiversity it's protected.
Well, Fabiano, you want to mention that, but maybe I can also answer a little bit. I mean, I think that a lot of work is being done. I think Fabiano mentioned it with linear parks, using rivers or existing waterways that are either open air or also being progressively uncovered. Just recently in Sheffield, they've been basically freeing the rivers that used to be in the city that have been covered over during the Industrial Revolution and the growth of cities. In Rome, we have dozens of underground rivers that could be freed, shall we say, to create this kind of green and blue infrastructure going to the cities. I think there's plenty of positive examples of this, and somehow, depending of course on the conditions where you are, widening these rivers and cleaning out the sides and renaturalizing what used to be there is a big challenge. I was in Hong Kong earlier this year before COVID hit, and even there they've been trying to renaturalize what had become basically some urban channels, turning them back partly into rivers. The same in Korea and Seoul. They've stripped over a motorway and recovered the river that was underneath and made it into a green waterway. So I think there are plenty of possibilities. It's a matter of discussing with the people, finding the right-minded mayor and making things happen, maybe. Over.
Okay, so I guess maybe I can move on to more social side, human well-being, because we are getting some questions on that.
Oh, I can answer that one as well. Sorry, I thought you were going to go through all the panelists. No,
yeah, no, go ahead.
No, thank you very much for the question. It's a very important question, which refers to the matter of scale. You know? For instance, in the case of Stockholm, they have a policy of trying to keep the narrowest sections of the green wedges in the region of 500 meters. So if it gets smaller than that, they feel that that notion of being immersed in nature tends to become compromised. Of course, when we go into the more consolidated city, this becomes tricky. So they have this concept of the green weak links and how to also ensure that they get an extra level of attention, because they are normally the ones that are more under pressure in the central areas of cities. And as Simone said, you know, a lot of those green spaces, they have come about historically. You know, they were areas preserved for the crown, or they were rivers, they were creeks. So again, if anything else, I think one of the key things we have to bear in mind is the idea that we need to address the circumstances as they come. And in more consolidated areas, we have some also interesting examples in the use of different kinds of nature-based solution to try to keep the integrity of these linear connections. For example, and I think also Simone mentioned the idea of permeability. In Milan, the Comune di Milano is doing a process of depaving of various areas, also to increase permeability, but also to bring more nature and biodiversity into the city. Tree-lined streets, green roofs, green facades. Also in the case of Milan, Studio Land has come up with some very interesting ways in which, by design and by implementing nature-based solutions, we can hopefully also address this question of the problem of the width as we go to more consolidated areas. Hamburg also has a very interesting example with the landscape access that go again all the way from outside the city into the urban core.
Would anyone has anything to add? Because we have some social health related questions that I think it would be neat to touch on that. It's many social and cultural values provided by urban forests are hard to measure. And people from different backgrounds may interpret those values very differently. So would you have any examples of research that talks about that, or a good examples how cities are dealing with that kind of stuff?
And I think there's quite a lot going on. In the UK, there's an ecosystem knowledge network, and they're trying to think broadly across all the kind of ecosystem services, including cultural ecosystem services. And they've got a range of case studies of different parts of the country that are trying to kind of take an ecosystem approach to the management of green space. And I think that sort of brings together, that's often, requires some sort of spatial mapping of the spaces and values associated with them, some sort of, looking at big data sets, but also from the kind of social and cultural. Then there's often, you need some sort of participatory or deliberative approach to try and, get to some of those kind of deeper meanings. And there's a lot of interesting work going on bringing in the kind of creative arts. So creative writers, artists to kind of help us kind of think about nature and green space in a different way that can really kind of speak to people. But again, one of the challenges is how to bring all those things together. So there's a real kind of debate about, well, the Treasury needs to have £, shillings and pence. But actually, often, these values are not always kind of surfaced, and they come through catalyst points when there's some sort of, road building or development where people say, we're losing this space. This is really important to us. And sometimes it's not until then that you find out how important these places are to people. And some work that we did last year, it was the centenary of the Forestry Commission, and they asked people to write a tribute to trees online. And just anything, story, poem, photograph. And, what came back was really quite interesting in terms of the kind of real focus on the emotional and kind of sensory engagement that people had with trees. So there's lots of ways to capture it, but how you use it in different levels of decision making, I think, is still, a live debate.
Yeah, since we have 2 minutes left, I just want to touch on, because trees and forests is solution for everything. We've heard that, and that's my bias in all of this. And from Jana about locking carbon, and that the trees from outside, in fact, they're locked in buildings. So your opinion on obviously on that, and how those wooden buildings would support, let's say, vertical forest. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so just to make sure I'm answering the question you're asking, are you asking the question, is a better way for us to create vertical forests to go with wood construction, or could we use—
No, it's, if let's say we are locking carbon with wooden buildings and we are more sustainable, not big footprint out on the outside landscape, but still we need vertical forests because of our density.
Yeah.
So what's is there a solution for that? You know, wood it's not the same as cement to support vertical forest.
I see what you're asking. Yeah, right. I mean, you can't go as tall with purely wood construction as you can with steel and concrete. So I think actually the hybrid building typology that uses a lot of wood to store the carbon and also is much less expensive to construct and has lower embodied energy, with some strategic placement of steel to strengthen the structure and get the high rise. Someone also asked the question, like, what about combining cross-laminated timber buildings with things like green roofs and balconies as opposed to wrapping it in a forest? And I think those hybrid solutions are the way to go. You know, the Vasco Verticale was like this example of you know, kind of like this extreme experiment, but I think the real trick will be combining the best strategies and using building craft to make sustainable buildings that last and don't mold or decay. So yeah, I'd say hybrid construction is the way to go, with lots of wood, but steel for reinforcing, and concrete probably for foundations. And foundations are you know, probably gonna work anytime soon, so.
I wish if we can keep longer talking about this. We touch on everything from planning to microorganisms, and thank you so much. Thank you to all speakers, Simone Borelli, Liz O'Brien, Fabiano, Lemes, Oliveira, Jana, VanderGoot, and my apology if I mispronounce any of your surnames. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We would also like to thank our Daniel's Public Programming Committee for organizing this year's series, which are definitely more challenging because of the technology and doing it online. And I would like to remind everyone to see the rest of the NEL's events for this year. Please go to our webpage. And our next lecture is coming on October 30th, and it's about the title, it's Towards Half Designing for Climate Positive Future by Kelly Doran. And after that, we have the one on November 5th, which will be on George Bird's contribution to architecture. And my apology for stumbling here, because obviously I'm more forester. And thank you so much for everyone joining us tonight from all over the world. Again, I wish if you had more time for these questions. Hopefully there will be next time. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. There were so many good questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Jana.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.